The bonding ceremony was supposed to be the beginning of everything. Instead, it became the exact moment her entire world shattered into absolute, irredeemable silence. The great hall of Winterstone Keep was suffocatingly warm, filled with the heavy scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the cloying, over-applied perfumes of the northern nobility. Hundreds of crystal candles burned overhead in massive iron chandeliers, casting a golden, flickering light over the gathered pack. They were all watching. Hundreds of eyes, gleaming with primal curiosity and predatory anticipation, were locked onto the elevated stone dais, where the future of their leadership was meant to be sealed. For generations, the Winterstone pack had prided itself on tradition and brutal strength, and this night was meant to be the culmination of a decade-long political promise. Seren stood perfectly still at the center of the altar. The velvet fabric of her ceremonial dress, a deep midnight blue that had taken her months to hand sew in the dim light of her cramped quarters, felt suddenly like a heavy shroud wrapping around a corpse. She did not tremble. She did not gasp. She merely focused her gaze on the flickering flame of a single candle mounted on the far wall, forcing her heart rate to slow, forcing her lungs to draw in air with measured, silent precision. She had spent a lifetime learning how to make herself small, how to endure the quiet indignities of her existence, but she had never anticipated this specific public execution of her pride. A few feet away, Gideon Drake stood before the pack elders. The beta heir of Winterstone looked immaculate in his tailored silver-threaded coat, his posture rigidly straight, his chin lifted with the unearned arrogance of a man who had never faced a true battle. But he was not looking at his betrothed. He was looking everywhere else. He looked at the elders, their faces carved from stone. He looked at the uneven flagstones of the floor. And then he looked to his right, where Marilyn Vantrell stood, entirely too close to the ceremonial altar, her posture practically leaning into his personal space. "I cannot complete this rite," Gideon announced, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. The sound of his words seemed to instantly suck all the remaining oxygen from the room. The crackle of the hearth fires suddenly sounded deafening. "The moon goddess demands absolute truth in our bonds, and I can no longer live a lie," Gideon continued, puffing out his chest. "My wolf does not recognize the woman standing before me as my equal. She is wolfless. She is silent. My heart does not recognize her as my future, nor does it see her as the mother of the next generation of Winterstone." A collective, low murmur rippled through the crowd. It was the sound of 100 wolves whispering, a sound composed of shock, morbid thrill, and cruel validation. They fed on weakness, and to them, the young woman standing alone on the dais was bleeding out in front of their eyes. "For the strength of Winterstone, I must choose a mate whose blood and spirit align with the prosperity of our people," the beta heir declared, his voice gaining a false, theatrical confidence as he finally reached out. He did not reach for the woman he had been promised to since childhood. He did not reach for the woman who had quietly managed the estate's ledgers and healed his injuries with her vast knowledge of herbs when he was too proud to see a physician. Instead, his hand extended to the side, closing firmly over Marilyn's delicate silk-gloved fingers. "I claim Marilyn as my true chosen mate. She is the light this pack needs." Marilyn let out a soft, meticulously practiced gasp. She pressed her free hand to her chest, her wide, doe-like eyes scanning the crowd as if she were a tragic victim of overwhelming, uncontrollable fate. She leaned into the man's side, burying her face in the shoulder of his silver coat, her shoulders shaking in an award-winning pantomime of sorrow. It was a flawless performance. Standing in the shadows near the grand pillars, Evelyn Vantrell did not even try to hide her reaction. The cruel, status-obsessed matriarch allowed a slow, poisonous smirk to stretch across her heavily powdered face. The stepmother had spent years whispering poison into the ears of the pack elders, years systematically eroding her stepdaughter's standing, framing Seren's quiet nature as weakness and her lack of a shifted wolf as a divine curse. This public execution of dignity was her masterpiece. She watched the dais with hungry, glittering eyes, waiting for the humiliated outcast to break. Evelyn wanted tears. She wanted screaming. She wanted a hysterical, pathetic display that would completely justify the betrayal in the eyes of the entire territory. Silence. The young woman at the center of the altar did not give them a single drop of the melodrama they craved. Seren did not look at her stepsister's fake tears, nor did she look at the smug, radiant satisfaction pouring from her stepmother. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her expression a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. She finally shifted her gaze to Gideon. For one long agonizing second, the Beta heir was forced to meet her eyes. He expected to see devastation. He expected to see a desperate, weeping plea for him to reconsider, for him to remember their childhood promises. Instead, he saw absolutely nothing. Her eyes were like twin panes of frosted glass, reflecting his own towering cowardice right back at him. Slowly, deliberately, Seren raised her left hand. The ambient noise in the great hall died away completely, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and shifting boots. Her right fingers brushed against the cheap cold iron band encircling her ring finger, the shattered ring of betrothal. It was a pathetic, flawed piece of jewelry inlaid with a common moonstone, given to her years ago with half-hearted promises by a boy who was too weak to become a real man. For years, the crude, unpolished metal had pinched her skin, leaving a permanent, faint red mark, a physical manifestation of a relationship that had always caused far more subtle pain than joy. She did not yank it off in a fit of rage. She did not throw it at his face. She slid the cold metal over her knuckle with the calm, detached precision of a surgeon amputating a dead, necrotic limb. Gideon opened his mouth, perhaps to offer some hollow, patronizing apology, but the words died instantly in his throat beneath the crushing weight of her stare. She held the ring suspended between her thumb and forefinger for a fraction of a heartbeat. Then she opened her hand. The ring dropped. The sharp, metallic clink of the cold iron hitting the ancient stone floor rang out like a gunshot in the dead silent hall. The little moonstone cracked straight down the middle upon impact, the pieces scattering slightly across the uneven stone. It was a final, undeniable severing. Without waiting for the elders to speak, without looking back at the coward who had just destroyed her reputation, she turned her back on the altar. The crowd, dense and predatory just moments before, unconsciously parted for her. The sheer, freezing weight of her presence forced them to step aside. They did not understand it, this sudden, overwhelming aura of authority emanating from a wolfless female, but their primal instincts demanded they clear a path. She kept her head bowed and her spine straight. Every step she took away from the dais was measured, silent, and unhurried. Her heart hammered a frantic, bruised rhythm against her ribs, and a hollow ache was already beginning to carve out her stomach. But she refused to let her biological reactions betray her in front of her abusers. She would not run. Running was for prey. As she reached the grand entryway, the heavy oak doors were hauled open by the estate guards, who stared at her with a complicated mixture of pity and awe. The moment the doors cracked open, the vicious, howling wind of the northern winter ripped into the hall, blowing out the candles nearest the entrance and sending a violent, biting chill through the gathered nobility. She stepped over the threshold and into the violent, swirling blackness of the blizzard. The doors closed behind her with a massive, echoing thud, sealing the warmth, the betrayal, and her entire past behind 3 feet of solid oak. The transition from the stifling, perfume-choked heat of the great hall to the absolute zero of the mountain road was a physical shock that instantly stole the breath from her lungs. The wind was a solid, physical force, carrying shards of ice that bit into the exposed skin of her neck and bare arms like crushed glass. The midnight blue velvet of her ceremonial dress, so heavy and stifling indoors, offered absolutely no protection against the sheer malice of the elements. She began to walk. The path leading away from the keep was a treacherous, winding ribbon of frozen mud and deep snowdrifts, bordered by towering, ancient pine trees that groaned and snapped under the immense weight of the storm. Within minutes, The faint golden glow of the estate's windows vanished behind the dense, swirling curtain of falling snow, leaving her in complete, crushing darkness. The cold seeped through the thin leather soles of her ceremonial slippers almost immediately. Her toes went numb, followed rapidly by a burning, painful tingling in her calves. The physical agony of the freezing temperature was almost a relief. It provided a sharp, immediate distraction from the cavernous betrayal hollowed out inside her chest. The cold demanded her complete attention. It demanded survival. She was entirely alone, a wolfless female, cast out into a territory known for violent rogue attacks and sub-zero death. It was a death sentence, unspoken but perfectly understood by everyone in that hall. Gideon had not just broken a promise, he had effectively cast her into the abyss, leaving the elements to finish the job Evelyn had started years ago. And yet, as she dragged her freezing, unresponsive feet through the rising snow, a strange, dark sense of liberation began to spark deep within her core. She was no longer bound to a coward. She was no longer required to shrink her intellect, her grace, and her spirit to make a vain beta. She was likely going to freeze to death on this mountain road before morning, but she would do it entirely on her own terms, with her dignity completely intact. Her breath plumed in front of her in ragged white clouds. Her eyelashes were heavy with clustering frost, making it difficult to keep her eyes open. Her hands, devoid of gloves, were tucked tightly under her arms in a desperate, futile attempt to conserve body heat. 15 minutes into her silent march toward oblivion, the ground beneath her feet began to change. It was a subtle vibration at first, barely perceptible over the shrieking wind, a deep, rhythmic trembling that seemed to originate not from the air, but from the ancient bedrock of the mountain itself. The outcast paused, leaning heavily against the frozen, rough bark of a massive pine tree. She blinked through the blinding snow, her frost-bitten ears straining to identify the sound over the storm. It was the thunder of massive hooves. But the cadence was entirely wrong. It was too heavy, too perfectly synchronized, and impossibly fast for the treacherous, icy terrain of the northern borders. Suddenly, the dense white wall of the blizzard parted. Emerging from the blinding snow was a nightmare forged of sheer power and impossible wealth. 4 colossal shadow steeds, beasts bred in the dark, volcanic regions of the deep south, tore down the mountain road. Their coats were darker than a starless night, their eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural crimson light that cut through the storm. They did not struggle against the snow. They crushed it beneath iron-shod hooves, treating the treacherous ice as if it were mere dust. Behind the terrifying beasts was a carriage of unimaginable scale and luxury, the Sterling Crest carriage. It was constructed entirely of heavy obsidian wood, reinforced with thick bands of dark steel that gleamed even in the darkness. Emblazoned on its side in pure, molten gold was the unmistakable wolf and crown crest of the Lycan throne. The royal carriage did not slow down gradually. It came to a sudden, violent halt barely 10 feet from where Seren stood shivering against the tree. The massive shadow steeds stamped their hooves, exhaling huge plumes of hot steam that instantly melted the falling snow in mid-air. For a moment, the world stood perfectly, terrifyingly still. The heavy iron door of the carriage clicked open. A man stepped down into the vicious storm with the effortless, lethal grace of a highly trained killer. Caelan Voss, the royal messenger and personal guard to the throne, wore a tailored uniform of midnight black and silver. His face was a mask of absolute, professional discipline. He did not look at the freezing, abandoned woman with pity. He looked at her with the deep, ingrained respect, reserved only for absolute authority. He turned back to the dark interior of the carriage, bowed his head deeply, and held the heavy door wide open. Then the world shifted permanently on its axis. A heavy, leather-booted foot stepped out onto the frozen mud. When Valerius Sterling emerged from the obsidian carriage, the very air pressure on the mountain road seemed to instantly double. The supreme ruler of the Lycan Empire did not merely exist in a space. He conquered it by merely breathing. He was a towering monolith of lethal muscle and ancient, cursed blood, wrapped in a massive, floor-length coat of black wolf fur that brushed against the snow. His face was a masterpiece of masculine cruelty and regal perfection, all sharp, unforgiving angles and shadow, but it was his eyes that stopped her dead heart. They were a terrifying, swirling, storm-glass grey that seemed to glow with an inner, violent heat, completely at odds with the freezing landscape around him. The moment his boots touched the snow, a wave of impossible, radiant heat rolled outward from his massive body. The blizzard immediately surrounding him seemed to literally evaporate, the violent snow turning to heavy, harmless mist before it could even touch his broad shoulders. Then he looked at her. The impact was entirely physical. It was not a metaphor. The second the monarch's tempest-hued eyes locked onto her freezing, trembling form, a violent jolt of electricity ripped straight up her spine. The freezing air between them vanished, instantly replaced by the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of crushed cedar, ancient ozone, and burning amber. It filled her lungs, forcibly pushing out the sharp smell of the ice and the pine, wrapping around her brain like a heavy, narcotic blanket. Inside her chest, right in the exact place where Gideon's betrayal had left a gaping, bleeding hole, a spark ignited. It flared into a blazing, blinding inferno. A river of liquid silver fire rushed through her freezing veins, violently chasing away the frostbite, snapping the numbness in her fingers, warming her sluggish blood with an aggressive, terrifying possessiveness. The word thundered through their newly forged bond like a war drum. Mine. It was not spoken aloud, but the deep vibration of it rattled her very teeth. Valerius did not speak a single word of greeting. He did not ask for her name. He did not demand to know what a woman in a midnight blue velvet dress was doing, freezing to death on the borders of Winterstone. He simply saw the bruised, shivering, abandoned state of his fated mate, and a low, primal growl tore its way out of his chest, a sound so violent, so fiercely protective, that even the massive shadow steeds nervously stamped their hooves in response. Before she could even process the reality of the golden thread connecting their souls snapping into place, the king crossed the distance between them. He moved with terrifying, blinding speed. 1 second he was by the carriage door. The next he was towering directly over her, blocking out the storm, blocking out the world. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out with 2 massive, ungloved hands. When his palms cupped her freezing, frost-bitten face, the heat of his skin was like plunging into a molten forge. A soft, involuntary gasp broke past her blue lips as the absolute, crushing warmth of his ancient magic bled directly into her skin, soothing the physical agony of the cold instantly. His thumbs gently brushed over her high cheekbones, his storm-glass eyes mapping every micro-expression, every violent shiver, every trace of the trauma she had just endured. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked violently near his ear. The fury radiating from him was a physical weight that could have crushed a lesser wolf, but his touch was agonizingly, impossibly gentle, as if he were holding a shattered piece of precious glass that he was terrified of breaking any further. Without uttering a single syllable, Valerius unfastened the heavy metal clasp of his black fur coat. He stripped the massive garment from his own shoulders, entirely heedless of the freezing wind tearing at his dark tunic, and wrapped it completely around her trembling shoulders. The coat was enormous, swallowing her small frame whole, smelling entirely of his intoxicating scent, wrapping her in an impenetrable, heavy fortress of heat and cedar. He bent down, sliding one thick arm beneath her knees and the other securely around her back, and lifted her off the frozen earth as effortlessly as if she weighed absolutely nothing at all. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed by the sudden, violent activation of the ancient magic and the sheer relief of his heat to fight him. Her head fell naturally against the hard, solid wall of his chest. Beneath her ear, she could hear the steady, furious pounding of his heart, a heart that was beating entirely, exclusively for her. Valerius carried her back to the open door of the carriage. Cailan kept his head bowed, his eyes respectfully averted to the snowy ground, as the king stepped up into the velvet-lined, heavily heated interior of the mobile fortress. The royal guard closed the heavy iron door with a solid, definitive click, sealing out the blizzard, sealing out the betrayal, and locking her safely inside. The interior was a haven of plush black velvet and radiating warmth, heated by enchanted embers glowing softly in brass braziers. As Valerius settled her gently onto the wide leather seat, he did not let her go. He immediately pulled her sideways against his chest, his immense body acting as a physical shield against the memory of the storm. Against her collarbone, hidden safely beneath the heavy layers of his fur coat and her ruined dress, the ancient sun-born Pandon, an inheritance from her true mother she had kept secretly pressed to her skin her entire life, began to pulse. It glowed with a faint, warm, golden light, answering the terrifying, possessive heat of Valerius's fated mate mark burning beneath his dark tunic. For the first time in her life, as the obsidian carriage lurched forward to carry her far away from her abusers, Seren closed her eyes and simply allowed herself to be held. The royal transport tore through the blizzard with terrifying, unnatural speed, but inside its velvet-lined interior, the violent world outside had completely ceased to exist. The enchanted brass braziers mounted in the corners of the cabin radiated a steady, deep heat, casting long, flickering shadows against the plush leather seats. Yet, the true source of the intense temperature in the small space was not the magical embers. It was the towering, lethal predator sitting directly beside her, his massive frame angled to shield her entirely from the frosted glass of the windows. He sat so close that the dense, predatory heat radiating from his skin felt like a physical weight pressing against her, creating a sanctuary of warmth that aggressively pushed back against the lingering chill of her exile. Seren kept her eyes fixed on her own trembling hands, which were currently swallowed whole by the immense span of Valerius's palms. The physical shock of the sub-zero mountain road was finally beginning to recede, but the biological aftermath of the freezing temperature was vicious. As her sluggish blood began to circulate properly once more, a sharp, agonizing burning sensation flared across her knuckles and the tips of her fingers. It was the painful reality of tissue thawing, a stinging reminder of the death sentence she had just narrowly escaped by walking away from Winterstone Keep. She inhaled sharply, a tiny, involuntary hiss escaping her blue-tinted lips as the pain spiked, tearing through her meticulously crafted facade of endurance. The Alpha King reacted instantly. A low, dangerous rumble vibrated deep within his chest, a sound that was half-soothing growl and half-lethal promise, directed at whoever had put her in this condition. He did not ask if she was all right. His heightened Lycan senses were already intimately mapping every fluctuation in her heart rate, every ragged intake of breath, every microtremor in her exhausted muscles. The sheer intensity of his focus was overwhelming, a complete reversal from the invisible, unappreciated life she had led under her stepmother's roof. Slowly, deliberately, Valerius shifted his grip. He did not squeeze, terrified of causing her further pain. Instead, he began to rhythmically, meticulously stroke his thumbs over the bruised, freezing skin of her hands. His skin was impossibly hot, burning like the heart of a forge, and with every pass of his calloused thumbs, he intentionally pushed his ancient magic directly into her veins. It was a slow, deliberate act of absolute devotion. The physical sensation was intoxicating. The agonizing burn of the frostbite was instantly chased away by a wave of thick, liquid warmth that seeped past her skin and straight into her bones. The golden thread of their newly forged met bond hummed in the air between them, vibrating like a plucked harp string. With every second of extended skin-to-skin contact, the connection expanded, shifting from a fragile, new spark into a roaring, unshakable tether. Her inner spirit, which had been battered and suppressed by years of emotional starvation under Evelyn's cruel matriarchy, practically purred at the influx of pure, unfiltered Lycan power. The beast within her recognized her equal, her protector, and her ultimate sanctuary. For the first time in years, the hollow ache in her chest was completely filled. "Look at me," Valerius commanded. His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly within her sternum. It was not a plea. It was the unquestionable directive of a sovereign who was desperately trying to anchor his mate to reality. Seren forced her heavy, frost-crusted eyelashes to flutter upward. When her gaze collided with his, the breath was knocked clean out of her lungs. The icy silver of the king's eyes was completely gone, entirely swallowed by the feral, molten amber fire of his inner wolf. He was staring at her with a level of fierce, unhinged devotion that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. This was the most powerful, ruthless ruler of the Lycan Empire, a man whose name was whispered in terrified, hushed tones across the northern territories, and he was currently looking at her, as if she were the only living, breathing creature in the entire universe. He watched her face like a man watching water after wandering a desert for a lifetime. He catalogued the pale, translucent quality of her skin, the dark, bruised exhaustion painted beneath her eyes, and the way her lower lip still trembled slightly from the fading cold. His jaw tightened so severely that the corded muscles in his thick neck stood out in sharp relief. Without breaking eye contact, the massive ruler shifted his weight on the leather seat, turning fully toward her. He reached down with one hand, his movements painfully slow and telegraphed so as not to startle her, and gently grasped the hem of her ruined midnight blue velvet dress. The fabric was stiff with frozen mud and jagged ice crystals. With a terrifyingly casual display of sheer primal strength, Valerius effortlessly tore the frozen hem of the heavy fabric upward to expose her bare, frostbitten feet and calves. Seren instinctively tried to pull her legs back, a flush of deep embarrassment heating her cheeks. She was accustomed to hiding her injuries, accustomed to being mocked for any display of weakness by Evelyn and Marilyn. She did not want this magnificent, terrifying king to see the pathetic, bruised state of her frozen skin. "Do not hide from me," Valerius breathed, his voice dropping an octave lower, laced with a heavy, protective command that made her wolfless instincts immediately submit. "Never hide from me." His large, burning hands wrapped around her icy ankles. The contrast was staggering. The sheer size of his palms dwarfed her delicate bones, completely encircling her ankles with a heat that instantly melted the remaining ice crystals, clinging to her skin. He began to massage her calves, his thumbs pressing into the tight, frozen muscles with expert, agonizingly gentle precision. He was mapping her body like she was a territory he intended to worship for the rest of his life. The heavy, intoxicating scent of crushed cedar, ancient ozone, and burning amber filled the small cabin, utterly eradicating the faint, lingering smell of the Winterstone Great Hall. It was a sensory takeover. He was systematically rewriting her reality, replacing the cold, humiliating memory of Gideon's weak rejection with the undeniable weight of his physical presence. Every touch was a silent vow that she would never be discarded again. As Valerius continued his slow, methodical healing of her frozen limbs, the ancient sunborn Pondon, resting against her collarbone, reacted to the massive influx of his Lycan magic. The golden amulet pulsed rapidly against her skin, no longer a faint, secret glow, but a radiant, brilliant warmth that spread across her chest. The magic of her hidden bloodline recognized the ancient power of the sovereign, answering his protective fury with a soothing golden light of its own. Valerius paused, his molten amber eyes dropping to the glowing pendant, visible just above the collar of his black fur coat. He did not look surprised. He did not ask questions. He simply leaned down, closing the remaining distance between them, and pressed his lips directly over the glowing amulet, kissing the skin of her collarbone with a reverence that bordered on the religious. A violent shudder ripped through Seren's spine. The physical contact of his lips against her skin sent a shockwave of pure, unadulterated electricity straight down to her toes. The ethereal tether binding them snapped completely taut, singing with the unmistakable certainty of their bond. She didn't know the Alpha King had been searching for her bloodline for 7 years. She was entirely unaware that the heavy silver poisoning curse running through his veins could only be halted by the exact magic pulsing from her chest. All she knew was the crushing safety of his heavy arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid, unyielding torso. "You are freezing," he rasped, his lips still brushing against her collarbone, his hot breath sending shivers across her skin. "I will burn the entire kingdom to the ground before I allow you to feel that cold again." He shifted his grip, lifting her entirely off the leather seat and pulling her directly into his lap. Seren gasped softly at the sudden movement, her hands instinctively coming up to rest flat against his broad, muscular chest. She could feel the furious, hammering rhythm of his heart beneath the dark fabric of his tunic. It was beating so hard it felt like it was trying to crack through his ribs to get to her. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome of her past, she had learned to endure everything in dignified silence. But sitting here, completely enveloped in the staggering heat of her true fated mate, the rigid walls of her quiet endurance finally began to crack, the sheer unprecedented reality of being chosen. Not used, not owned, but actively, violently chosen, was more stunning than the blizzard had been. Valerius tucked her head beneath his chin, his massive hand coming up to cradle the back of her skull, his long fingers tangling in the damp, freezing strands of her hair. He held her with a desperate, possessive strength, as if he were terrified that if he loosened his grip for even a fraction of a second, the storm outside would snatch her back. The massive coach rocked slightly as it navigated the treacherous mountain pass, but inside his arms, Seren felt completely untethered from the world. The pain in her hands and feet had completely vanished, replaced by a heavy, languid warmth that seeped into her very marrow. Her exhausted, traumatized body finally realized that the immediate threat was over. The adrenaline crash was sudden and absolute, leaving her entirely dependent on the unyielding strength of the man holding her. Her eyelids grew impossibly heavy. The rhythmic, deep rumble of his chest as he breathed acted like a powerful sedative. She kept her hands flat against his heart, grounding herself in the physical reality of his heat. "Sleep," he murmured into her hair, his lips pressing a soft, lingering kiss against her crown. "I have you. I have you." For the first time in her life, Seren did not fight the darkness. She let her eyes flutter shut, her breathing slowing to match the deep, steady rhythm of the royal Lycan's chest, and allowed the heavy, intoxicating scent of cedar and amber to pull her down into a deep, dreamless sleep, the transition from the violent, howling blizzard of the northern borders to the impenetrable security of the capital was marked by a sudden, profound shift in the ambient noise. Seren remained suspended in the deep, heavy exhaustion of her trauma, her consciousness floating lazily in a sea of thick, narcotic warmth. She was vaguely aware of the heavily armored vehicle slowing its thunderous pace, the massive iron-shod hooves of the shadow steeds shifting from the crunch of snow to the sharp, echoing clatter on polished cobblestone. The violent wind that had relentlessly battered the mobile fortress died away entirely, replaced by the muffled, distant sounds of heavy iron gates groaning open and the sharp, disciplined shouts of the royal guard. The sheer scale of his military power was evident in the seamless, precise coordination happening just outside their private sanctuary. She did not open her eyes. She simply burrowed deeper into the solid, unyielding wall of muscle beneath her cheek, her hands instinctively tightening their grip on the fabric of Valerius's tunic. The king responded immediately, his massive arm tightening securely around her waist, his hand coming up to shield the side of her face from any potential intrusion. The obsidian carriage came to a smooth, flawless halt. Outside, the heavy booted footsteps of Calen Voss approached the door. The royal messenger did not knock. Such an action would be an intolerable breach of protocol, but he pulled the heavy iron handle with smooth, silent efficiency. The door swung open, letting in a rush of cool, crisp air that smelled faintly of burning pine and polished steel, a stark contrast to the thick cedar and amber scent saturating the cabin. "My king," Calen's voice was low, clipped, and meticulously respectful. We have arrived at the inner sanctum. The perimeter is entirely secure. Valerius did not answer immediately. The silence stretching from the cabin was heavy, laden with a protective, lethal tension. When he finally moved, it was with terrifying, controlled precision. He did not wake her. He did not ask her to stand. He simply adjusted the heavy layers of his black fur coat, ensuring that it completely swallowed her small frame, hiding her face, her ruined dress, and her bruised limbs entirely from the view of the outside world. He stepped out of the cabin, carrying her effortlessly against his chest, refusing to let her feet touch the ground. The central courtyard of the capital was an architectural masterpiece of intimidation and supreme power. Towering walls of smooth, black volcanic stone rose high into the night sky, illuminated by massive braziers that cast a warm, flickering light over the meticulously maintained grounds. Iron-wrought banners bearing the gilded wolf and crown crest snapped violently in the high-altitude wind, a constant reminder of the Empire's unyielding strength. Elite warriors of the Lycan Empire, men and women who had survived the most brutal wars of the Third Age, lined the pathway leading to the main keep, standing in perfect, unbroken formation. As his boots touched the cobblestone, every single warrior in the courtyard dropped to one knee in synchronized silence. Heads bowed, weapons lowered, they offered their complete, unquestioning submission. They did not dare look up. They did not dare whisper. The scent of their king's feral, possessive fury rolled across the courtyard like a physical shockwave, carrying with it the unmistakable, delicate scent of a newly claimed mate. Valerius ignored them all. His amber eyes were locked dead ahead on the massive iron doors of the central keep. He walked with long, purposeful strides, his heavy boots echoing off the stone walls. His grip on the sleeping woman was ironclad, a physical manifestation of his refusal to ever let her touch the ground again if she did not wish to. Inside the warmth of his coat, Seren finally began to drift closer to waking. The rhythmic sway of his walk, the deep, steady thud of his heartbeat beneath her ear, and the muffled sounds of the capital slowly pierced through her exhaustion. She blinked heavily, her vision blurry, the golden light of the braziers filtering through the narrow opening of the fur collar. She caught a fragmented glimpse of towering black pillars, vaulted ceilings painted with ancient constellations, and endless rows of silent, bowing servants. It was a world of unimaginable wealth and crushing authority, a place that made the great hall of Winterstone Keep look like a pathetic, crumbling barn. Where? She tried to speak, her voice coming out as a dry, fractured whisper that scraped painfully against her throat. Valerius felt the vibration of her vocal cords against his chest. He immediately slowed his pace, angling his head down to press his lips against her temple. "Hush," he murmured, his voice a soothing, rumbling vibration that settled deep into her bones. "We are home. You are safe." He carried her up a sweeping, grand staircase carved from solid white marble, bypassing the public receiving rooms, and heading straight into the most heavily guarded, restricted wing of the estate. The architecture here shifted from imposing military stone to exquisite, ancient luxury. The air here was noticeably warmer, saturated with the faint, calming scent of lavender, expensive oils, and the lingering presence of the king himself. Every servant they passed immediately dropped to the floor, pressing their foreheads to the marble, refusing to gaze upon the newly discovered Luna. It was an absolute display of respect that directly contrasted the vile humiliation she had suffered just hours prior. Kaelin walked silently 10 paces ahead, pulling open a set of massive, intricately carved mahogany doors before stepping aside and bowing deeply. Valerius carried her across the threshold and into the sanctuary chamber. The room was vast, yet it possessed a profound, intimate warmth that immediately triggered a deep sense of biological safety. A massive fireplace took up the entirety of the far wall, a roaring fire already crackling merrily, casting a rich golden glow over the plush, dark carpets and the heavy, velvet-draped windows. In the center of the room sat a bed so large it looked more like a raised dais, piled high with thick furs, silk pillows, and heavy quilts. It was the absolute definition of a nesting room, a space designed meticulously for comfort, recovery, and impenetrable security. The scent of the room was a perfect, harmonious blend of his crushing cedar and amber aura, cut with the delicate, soothing sweetness of chamomile and dried winter berries. It was a space that had been meticulously prepared, waiting empty for years for the single soul who was worthy of occupying it. The sheer scale of his anticipation was written into every lavish detail of the sanctuary. He did not set her down immediately. Valerius walked to the center of the room, standing perfectly still, allowing the intense heat of the fireplace to fully chase away the last lingering chill from her bones. He kept her securely, cradled against his chest, his chin resting lightly on top of her head, simply breathing her in. The physical connection between them continued to strengthen, wrapping around her bruised soul like a shield. Seren shifted slightly in his hold, pushing the heavy fur coat back just enough to look at him. The molten amber fire had receded from his eyes, leaving behind the thundercloud silver that had first stopped her heart on the freezing mountain road. He was looking down at her with an expression so open, so devastatingly raw, that she had to remind herself to breathe. He slowly, reverently lowered her onto the edge of the massive bed. The mattress was incredibly soft, yielding perfectly to her weight, but the Alpha King did not step back. He immediately dropped to one knee on the thick carpet, placing himself physically lower than her. For a ruler who demanded the submission of an entire empire, this gesture of lowering himself to her eye level was a profound, earth-shattering display of devotion. He reached up, his massive, hot hands gently cupping her face once more. His thumbs brushed away a stray, damp lock of silver-white hair that had plastered itself to her cheek. "Listen to me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rasp that commanded her undivided attention. "You will never return to the cold. You will never be forced to make yourself small, to hide your strength, or to bow to those who are unworthy of breathing the same air as you." Seren stared at him, the sheer intensity of his vow vibrating through their newly formed spiritual link. She could feel the unshakable truth in his words. There was no hesitation, no political calculation, no doubt. He was stating a universal law. "Gideon Drake and Evelyn Van Trell believe they have discarded a broken thing," Valerius continued, his eyes darkening with a flash of lethal, violent promise. "They do not know they have just handed me the true heart of my empire. A name whispered only in the dark of that frozen keep grows teeth, my queen. And when the time comes, I will gladly let you tear their world apart. But this night..." He smoothed his thumbs over her cheekbones, his touch agonizingly gentle. "This night you rest. This night you let me carry the weight." Seren kept her spine straight, her quiet dignity unbroken, but the hollow ache in her stomach finally dissolved completely, replaced by a deep, undeniable sense of belonging. The phantom weight of the shattered ring of Betrothal, which had dragged her down for so long in the Great Hall, was entirely eradicated by the golden light of the sunborn Pondorn. She had no idea of the full extent of the ancient magic pulsing in her chest. She could not fathom the sheer scale of the retribution the king was already silently planning. And she undoubtedly had no inkling that this sanctuary chamber would soon become the birthplace of a hidden royal heir. All she knew was the intense, crushing warmth of his hands, the steady, reliable beat of his heart, and the quiet certainty that she had finally been found. She slowly reached up, her small, thawing fingers wrapping gently around his thick wrist, and gave a single, silent nod. Valerius closed his eyes, a heavy, ragged sigh tearing its way out of his chest, and leaned his forehead gently against hers. He breathed her in, locking her scent into his lungs, his massive frame finally relaxing, now that she was securely within his walls. In the quiet, absolute safety of the sanctuary room, the true healing began. The awakening was agonizingly slow, a gentle, languid resurfacing from the deepest, most impenetrable sleep the young woman had ever experienced. For the first time in over a decade, Seren did not wake to the biting, drafty chill of her cramped quarters at Winterstone Keep, nor to the sharp, demanding shrieks of her stepmother echoing down the stone corridors. Instead, she woke to absolute pristine silence, wrapped in a cocoon of staggering warmth. Sunlight, thick and golden, filtered through the heavy velvet drapes of the sanctuary chamber, casting long, lazy beams across the plush dark carpets. She lay perfectly still beneath the mountain of silk sheets and heavy furs, taking a slow, deliberate inventory of her physical form. The excruciating, burning agony of the frostbite that had threatened to claim her limbs just hours prior was completely gone. In its place was a deep, resonant vitality. Her toes and fingertips tingled with healthy, rushing blood, and the bruised, hollow ache in her chest had been meticulously filled with the lingering, intoxicating scent of crushed cedar, ancient ozone, and burning amber. It was the physical signature of the Alpha King, a scent that had been deliberately pressed into every pillow, every woven thread of the blankets, creating an invisible, impenetrable fortress around her recovering body. She shifted, her skin brushing against the unimaginably soft fabric of a pristine white silk nightgown that had been provided for her. Against her collarbone, the ancient sunborn pondon rested quietly. It was no longer glowing with the desperate, blinding intensity of the previous night, but it emanated a steady, comforting heat, like a dormant ember waiting for a breath of wind. The magic in her blood, suppressed and hidden for a lifetime out of pure survival instinct, felt relaxed. It felt safe, but the massive bed was empty. The towering, lethal predator, who had carried her through the blizzard and knelt on the floor beside her, was no longer in the room. A sudden, deep vibration pulled her attention toward the heavy mahogany doors leading to the private anteroom. It was not a sound meant for human ears. It was a low, subsonic rumble that rattled the crystal decanters on the bedside table and sent a frantic, primal warning down the base of her spine. The air pressure in the bedchamber seemed to drop violently, pulling the oxygen toward the adjacent room. Seren did not cower. She threw back the heavy furs, her bare feet hitting the warm, carpeted floor, without a single hesitation. The quiet dignity that had allowed her to survive Evelyn's psychological warfare now propelled her forward. She crossed the vast expanse of the nesting room, her steps completely silent, and paused just behind the slightly ajar door of the anteroom. The temperature in the adjoining study was suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and sheer, unadulterated Lycan fury. "Repeat it," a voice demanded. It was the Alpha King, but the tone was entirely unrecognizable from the gentle protector who held her the night before. This voice was a weapon forged in the deepest abysses of the world. It was a terrifying, gravelly rasp, dragged over jagged rocks, devoid of any mercy, vibrating with the feral promise of immediate slaughter. Standing in the center of the study, maintaining a posture of flawless military discipline despite the crushing aura of his sovereign, was Caelan Voss. The royal messenger kept his chin perfectly level, his hands clasped behind his back, though the silver buttons on his dark uniform trembled slightly from the sheer physical pressure emanating from the monarch. "The scouts intercepted the communications at dawn, my king," Caelan reported, his voice crisp and devoid of personal emotion, delivering the intelligence with surgical precision. "Gideon Drake and Evelyn Vantrell have immediately moved to control the rumors surrounding the broken betrothal. They are actively spreading a false decree across the Northern Territories. They claim that the young lady did not leave of her own volition. They claim she was caught stealing ancient heirlooms from the Winterstone pack vaults to fund a secret escape, and that the Beta heir righteously broke the engagement upon discovering her treason. They are painting her flight into the blizzard as the desperate act of a guilty, disgraced thief, attempting to cover their own dishonor with her reputation. A heavy, terrifying silence descended upon the study. It was the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic natural disaster. Through the crack in the door, Seren watched Valerius Sterling. The king was standing by the massive stone fireplace, his broad back turned to the guard. He was dressed in tailored black combat leathers, the dark fabric pulled taut over the massive, coiled muscles of his shoulders. His large hands rested flat against the heavy stone mantle. Then the stone began to crack. A jagged, spiderweb fracture shot up the solid granite of the fireplace under the sheer, impossible force of his grip. The ambient temperature of the room skyrocketed, driven by the explosive molten amber fire that had completely swallowed the usual stormy hue of his eyes. The Alpha King was not merely angry. He was watching his inner beast tear at its chains, entirely willing to let the monster loose upon the world that had dared to slander his fated mate. "Summon the vanguard," Valerius whispered. The quietness of the command made it infinitely more terrifying than a shout. "Ready the shadow steeds. Lock down the borders of the Northern Territory. No one leaves Winterstone. No one breathes without my permission. I will march on that pathetic keep before the sun reaches its zenith. I will tear their walls down to the bedrock, and I will personally rip the tongue from Gideon Drake's mouth before I eradicate his entire bloodline from the history of this empire." Cailan bowed deeply, his boots pivoting on the stone floor to execute the order of total annihilation. "At once, my king, no." The single word cut through the suffocating, ozone-heavy air of the study like a blade through silk. Both men froze. Valerius whipped around, his chest heaving, the feral, amber light in his eyes, locking instantly onto the small figure standing in the doorway. Seren stepped fully into the anteroom. She looked impossibly fragile in the oversized white silk nightgown, her silver-white hair tumbling in loose, unbound waves over her shoulders, but her posture was forged from unyielding iron. She kept her spine straight, her chin lifted, refusing to let the terrifying aura of the Lycan monarch push her back a single inch. She did not look like a disgraced outcast. She looked like a judge stepping up to the executioner's block. Valerius crossed the room in 2 massive strides. The murderous intent radiating from his body vanished the absolute second he was within reaching distance of her, instantly replaced by a frantic, crushing need to protect. He dropped to one knee before her, his large hands hovering just an inch from her waist, desperately seeking permission to touch, terrified that his lingering rage might frighten her. "You should be resting," he breathed, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. "You should not have to hear the poison those vermin spit." Seren reached out. She did not tremble. She placed her small, warm palms flat against the hard, leather-clad armor of his chest, right over his hammering heart. The physical contact sent a jolt of pure golden warmth straight down the mate bond, hitting his furious soul like a tidal wave of cooling water. Valerius let out a ragged exhale, his eyes slipping shut for a fraction of a second as he leaned his forehead against her stomach, his massive hands finally settling lightly on her hips. The beast within him immediately submitted to the gentle, unyielding pressure of her hands. "They are cowards," she said, her voice steady, cold, and utterly devoid of the hysterical grief her stepmother would have expected. "Gideon needs a justification for breaking a sacred vow in front of the elders, and Evelyn needs my memory completely destroyed so that no one ever questions Marilyn's sudden elevation. If you ride to Winterstone today and slaughter them, you will simply prove their lies. You will look like a feral tyrant, attacking a pack that was just trying to rid itself of a thief. It will make them martyrs." The towering ruler pulled head back, looking up at her with a mixture of dark frustration and absolute, staggering awe. "I do not care what the Northern Territories think of my methods. I care that they breathed a lie against your name. I will drown them in their own blood for the insult. A quick death is a mercy they do not deserve," Seren countered softly, her frosted eyes meeting his burning amber gaze without flinching. She let her thumb brush gently against the collar of his leather tunic. "I spent a lifetime hiding in the shadows of that keep. I know exactly how Evelyn's mind works. She feeds on status. She feeds on public adoration. If you kill them now, in the dirt of their own ruined castle, they die believing they were important enough to provoke a war." Valerius stared at the woman standing above him. He had spent his entire life surrounded by warriors who solved problems with fangs and iron, by politicians who cowered and begged when faced with conflict. But the mate the universe had chosen for him did not beg for protection. She was calmly, methodically calculating the absolute psychological destruction of her enemies. It was the most beautiful, terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. "What is your command, my Luna?" He rasped, the title rolling off his tongue with a heavy, religious reverence. He was placing the military might of the entire Lycan Empire directly into the palms of her hands. "We let them lie," she stated, her voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. "We let them spread their rumors. We let Evelyn parade Marilyn around the territory as the new, glorious beta mate. We let them climb to the absolute highest pedestal of their arrogant pride. Because when they are standing at the very top, convinced they have won everything, the fall will break them completely. I want them to look up and see exactly who they discarded." A slow, dark, predatory smile spread across Valerius's face. The violence in his expression was still there, but it was no longer a wild, uncontrollable inferno. It was a focused, calculated weapon, entirely at her disposal. He turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the royal messenger, who was still standing silently by the door. "You heard her, Kaelin. Stand the vanguard down. Let the Winterstone pack spin their pathetic web. We will give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves." Kaelin bowed deeply, his eyes shining with a newfound, profound respect for the silver-haired woman. "As you command, my king, my queen." He stepped backward, pulling the heavy oak door shut and leaving them alone in the quiet tension of the study. Valerius turned his full attention back to Seren. He stood up slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the stone floor, yet he kept his hands carefully tucked behind his back, allowing her to control the physical space between them. "You have the heart of a sovereign," he murmured, his storm-glass eyes tracking the subtle golden pulse of the ancient amulet resting against her skin. "But revenge is a heavy stone to carry. You must step out of this room. You must breathe air that does not smell of war." Before she could register the shift in his mood, Valerius offered his arm. He did not pull her. He waited for her to willingly place her hand upon his sleeve. When she did, the luminous cord between them hummed with absolute approval. The journey from the private quarters to the restricted wing of the royal palace was a study in quiet authority. The towering stone arches were lined with ancient tapestries woven from silver and obsidian, chronicling the savage, bloody history of a bloodline that bowed to no one. Yet, as they walked, every member of the royal household, from the highest-ranking general to the lowest scullery maid, immediately stopped and bowed deeply at the waist. They did not stare, they did not whisper. They offered the utmost, unquestioning respect to the woman walking beside their lethal monarch. Stepping out into the ancient courtyards was like crossing the threshold into a different realm entirely. The crushing, claustrophobic stone of the citadel gave way to an explosion of untamed ancient magic. The palace grounds here were not a meticulously manicured, artificial display of wealth. They were a sprawling, primal sanctuary of towering silver-leafed willow trees, their massive branches sweeping down to brush against a carpet of vibrant emerald moss. The air here was incredibly crisp, lacking the bitter, biting edge of the northern mountains, saturated instead with the heavy, sweet scent of blooming moonflowers and rich, damp earth. The soil itself seemed to vibrate with ambient Lycan magic, a deep, resonant heartbeat that matched the rhythm pulsings in Valerius's chest. He led her to a secluded enclave deep within the ancient trees, where a wide bench carved from smooth, pale obsidian sat beside a crystal-clear, steaming thermal spring. The water bubbled gently, casting a warm mist into the cool morning air. Valerius sat down, pulling her gently onto the bench beside him. The physical proximity was immediate and necessary. His large thigh pressed firmly against hers, his natural body heat radiating outward to ensure the morning chill could not touch her. For a long time, they simply sat in the tranquil silence, listening to the soft rustle of the silver willow leaves. Seren kept her eyes on the water, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to bleed away. Here, under the ancient trees, the memory of Winterstone Keep felt like a pathetic, fading nightmare. The Sunborn magic, Valerius spoke suddenly, his voice incredibly quiet, lacking all the commanding edge of the throne room. He was not demanding information, he was offering a space for truth. It is a bloodline thought to be entirely eradicated during the Second Age. It is the magic of pure creation, of unbinding. Seren instinctively reached up, her fingers wrapping around the warm gold of the pendant. My biological mother passed it to me before she died. She made me swear to hide it. She knew that in a pack like Winterstone, power that does not manifest in fangs and claws is either destroyed or enslaved. Evelyn would have locked me in a lightless room and bled me for potions if she knew what lived in my veins. So I became invisible. I became the wolfless disappointment. I managed their ledgers, I healed their minor wounds with basic herbs, and I let them believe I was nothing. She turned her head, looking up at the fearsome ruler sitting beside her. I survived by being small, my king. Valerius's jaw tightened, a flash of pure agony crossing his features at the thought of her suffering in silence for years. You are not small. You were simply surrounded by creatures too blind to comprehend the sun. He slowly unbuckled the heavy leather bracer on his left forearm. He moved with deliberate caution, stripping the protective armor away and pushing up the sleeve of his dark tunic. Seren gasped softly. Beneath the flawless, muscular surface of his forearm, a network of thick, pitch-black veins spiderwebbed across his skin. The corruption pulsed with a sick, toxic rhythm, radiating a cold, unnatural malice that completely contradicted his intense lichen heat. It looked like shattered, dark glass buried just beneath the surface of his flesh. The silver poisoning curse, Valerius stated, his voice devoid of pity, treating his own fatal wound as a mere tactical disadvantage, inflicted by a rogue faction of warlocks 7 years ago. It cannot be healed by traditional Hylican regeneration. It slowly freezes the blood, moving inch by inch toward the heart. It is the reason I run hotter than any other alpha. My beast is in a constant, violent state of burning calories to stave off the freezing corruption. He looked at her, the storm-glass grey of his eyes completely open, completely vulnerable. The most dangerous man in the world was laying his fatal weakness directly in her lap. I have spent 7 years searching the continent for a trace of the Sunborn lineage, he confessed, his voice dropping to a raw, ragged whisper. Not to command it, but to beg for it. I did not know the moon goddess had tied my salvation directly to my soul. Seren did not hesitate. She did not shrink away from the terrifying, dark corruption staining his arm. She reached out, placing both of her small, delicate hands directly over the blackened veins. The sunborn Pondon resting against her chest flared, but the light was not the blinding, brilliant cascade of a fully awakened sovereign. It pulsed with a warm, steady, yet flickering golden hue. The magic, dormant and hidden for her entire existence, and still deeply exhausted from the brutal freezing temperatures of her exile, rushed down her arms and poured into the monarch's flesh. It was a gentle, harmonious coaxing, rather than a violent unbinding. The warmth that radiated from her palms was absolute, pure, and desperately healing. Valerius let out a sharp, breathless groan, his head falling back against the bark of the willow tree. The physical relief, even partial, was instantaneous and staggering. Beneath her fingers, the pitch-black veins did not vanish, but they began to thin. The toxic, freezing corruption retreated slightly from the surface of his skin, its dark tendrils forced back by her golden light. The heavy, agonizing pressure that had crushed his chest for 7 years finally eased enough for him to draw a full, unburdened breath, but almost as quickly as it began, the golden light began to sputter. Seren's hands trembled, a sudden wave of dizziness sweeping over her as the sheer scale of the curse pushed back against her depleted reserves. She swayed on the obsidian bench, her breathing turning shallow. Valerius reacted instantly. He caught her by the waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest, breaking the connection to save her strength. His eyes snapped open, filled with fierce, protective alarm. Enough, he commanded softly, supporting her weight effortlessly. Your magic is exhausted. You have survived too much cold, endured too much starvation to burn so brightly today. Seren rested her cheek against his shoulder, her chest heaving as she traced the edge of the dark, spider-webbed curse still visible on his skin. She looked at the lingering black veins, analyzing them with the sharp, methodical mind of a master healer. "It is deep," she whispered, her voice raspy but resolute. "The corruption is woven directly into the rhythm of your pulse. I cannot rip it out all at once without stopping your heart, my king. I need time. I need to study the corruption, to coax it out layer by layer as my own strength returns." Valerius looked down at her in absolute awe. She was completely drained, leaning against him for physical support, yet her mind was already mapping out a strategic campaign to save his life. She was not deterred by the impossibility of the curse. She was simply calculating the time required to break it. She would need to map the dark magic, to understand its origin, blending her sun-born light with the vast alchemical knowledge of his empire. It would become her singular focus, the ultimate proof of her worth to a court that had yet to meet her. "Then you shall have my grand library," Valerius promised, his thumb gently stroking the side of her pale face, marveling at the sheer resilience burning in her frosted eyes. "You shall have the entire wing of royal physicians at your absolute command. We have time, my Luna. For the first time in 7 years, I am not afraid of the cold." He shifted, carefully wrapping his arms around her to ensure the ambient chill of the garden could not touch her recovering body. He held her with a reverence that made her heart hammer violently against her ribs. "In the coming months," the towering ruler began, his voice dropping an octave, laced with a heavy, solemn gravity. "Your strength will return, your magic will flourish within the safety of these walls. And by the time the snows have completely melted, the regional banquet of the northern and eastern territories will be held in the grand hall of the capital." He paused, his thumb mapping the delicate bones of her wrist, sending a continuous stream of liquid warmth up her arm. "Gideon Drake and Evelyn Van Trell will be summoned to pledge their annual allegiance to the Lycan throne. They will come dressed in stolen finery, expecting to secure their new political alliances. They will expect to be honored for ridding themselves of a traitor." Valerius slid off the obsidian bench. He knelt on the damp, mossy earth of the secluded grove, entirely heedless of the dirt staining his tailored combat leathers. He placed himself physically lower than her, once again, looking up into her frosted eyes with absolute, unyielding devotion. "I do not want to simply punish them," the Alpha King vowed, the golden thread between them snapping taut, vibrating with the weight of his promise. "I want to shatter their reality, but I will not do it without your consent." He raised her hands, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to her knuckles. "When the time comes, when your magic is fully awakened, and this curse is completely broken from my veins," he asked, the request tearing its way out of his chest, "will you stand beside me as my queen? Will you let them see the true sovereign they threw away?" Seren looked down at the towering Lycan ruler, kneeling in the damp earth simply to ask for her consent. The sacred tie bridging their spirits flared, vibrating with a warmth that completely eclipsed the bitter memory of Winterstone Keep. She kept her spine straight, but a soft, genuine smile finally broke through her guarded expression. She reached out, resting her small hands gently against the sides of his face, feeling the steady, reassuring heat of his skin. "I will stand with you, my king," she whispered, the words sealing their vow into the ancient magic of the sanctuary. "And we will let them break themselves against our walls." Months had passed since the violent blizzard of the northern borders. The snows had melted, giving way to the vibrant, blooming warmth of spring, and the imperial capital had transformed into a beacon of unparalleled opulence for the annual regional banquet. The grand hall of the royal palace in the capital was a monolith of black stone, yawning with the sheer weight of imperial gold. Massive pillars of polished obsidian stretched toward a vaulted ceiling, painted with constellations of crushed diamonds and liquid gold. Thousands of enchanted floating embers illuminated the vast space, casting a warm, flickering glow over the hundreds of elite lords, pack alphas, and high-ranking dignitaries gathered to pledge their fealty. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, exotic spices, and the heavy, intoxicating perfumes of the realm's most powerful families. Amidst this suffocating display of imperial might, the delegation from Winterstone Keep maneuvered through the crowd with an air of practiced, desperate arrogance. Gideon Drake wore a tailored military coat of deep crimson velvet, heavy with ceremonial silver medals that he had never earned in actual combat. Gideon kept his chest puffed out, offering tight, overly confident smiles to the passing nobility, though a thin sheen of nervous sweat clung to his forehead. The ambient lichen magic radiating from the walls of the royal palace in the capital was incredibly dense, pressing down on his weaker provincial wolf with a constant, subconscious demand for submission. Yet he forced himself to stand tall, holding a crystal goblet of imported elven wine, desperately trying to project the image of a seasoned leader, ready to secure a lucrative tax exemption from the crown. Clinging tightly to his arm was Marilyn Vantrell. The newly instated mate had spared absolutely no expense for her debut at the royal court. Her gown was a chaotic explosion of imported silk and glittering pearls, a garment so excessively extravagant it bordered on the theatrical. It was a dress purchased with the very pack funds they had publicly accused her stepsister of stealing. Marilyn fluttered her meticulously painted eyelashes, offering a breathless, manufactured laugh at a joke told by a neighboring lord. She leaned into Gideon's side, playing the role of the delicate, radiant savior of the North to absolute perfection. To the untrained eye, she was the picture of innocent prosperity, but beneath the heavy layers of expensive floral perfume, the faint, sour scent of her deep-seated insecurity occasionally leaked through. Trailing half a step behind them, pulling the invisible strings of their entire political charade, was Evelyn Vantrell. The matriarch looked like a bird of prey wrapped in dark, iridescent feathers. Her heavily powdered face was set in a mask of polite, aristocratic superiority, but her sharp, glittering eyes darted relentlessly across the room, cataloguing every weakness, every potential alliance, every rival she needed to crush. This night was meant to be the absolute pinnacle of her life's work. She had systematically destroyed her stepdaughter, purged the weak, wolfless embarrassment from their bloodline, and elevated her biological child to the highest seat of power in their territory. The rumors they had planted months ago had taken root beautifully. Across the northern borders, the name of the discarded outcast was synonymous with treason and thievery. "Keep your chin up, darling," the older woman murmured, her voice a sharp, hushed hiss that barely parted her painted lips. "The Eastern Lords are watching us. Show them the grace that Winterstone requires. We are not just provincial nobility anymore. Once the Sovereign approves our new trade routes tonight, we will control the entire mountain pass." Marilyn nodded quickly, her grip on the young man's arm tightening. "Of course. Mother, do you think the monarch will grant us a private audience? I have heard the ruler has been incredibly reclusive this season." Gideon took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, puffing out his chest even further. "The king has not hosted a formal gathering since the winter solstice. The rumors say he is recovering from a military campaign, but our timing is flawless. We removed a traitor from our ranks, stabilized the territory, and brought a hefty tithe. The crown respects strength and decisiveness. My father was weak, but I have proven that I will cut out rot the moment I see it. The monarch will reward our loyalty." A neighboring dignitary, an older alpha from an eastern province, paused beside their small circle. He cast a curious, slightly judgmental glance over the extravagant display of pearls woven into the young woman's hair. "Gideon Drake," the older man greeted, his tone carefully neutral. "Your territory has been the subject of much gossip lately. A dramatic broken betrothal, as a sudden flight into a blizzard, and accusations of a plundered vault. One wonders how a single, wolfless female managed to bypass your entire estate guard and vanish into the mountains without a trace." Evelyn did not miss a beat. She stepped forward smoothly, inserting herself between the two men with a practiced, sorrowful sigh. She pressed a silk handkerchief to her chest, her expression twisting into a flawless mask of maternal grief and righteous indignation. "It is a tragedy that still pains our family deeply." The matriarch lied smoothly, her voice dripping with venom coated in honey. The girl was disturbed. We tried to give her a respectable life, tried to hide her deficiencies from the world. But greed is a sickness that cannot be cured by kindness. She used her knowledge of the estate's ledgers to drain our accounts, fleeing into the storm out of pure cowardice when her crimes were discovered. It broke Gideon's heart to sever the bond, but a leader must put the safety of his pack above his own sentimental attachments. Gideon nodded solemnly, playing his part in the practiced delusion perfectly. I could not allow a thief to become the mother of the next generation. Marilyn has brought the light back to our keep. We are here tonight to look toward the future, not dwell on the treachery of a ghost. The older Alpha offered a stiff, non-committal nod, clearly uninterested in digging further into the provincial drama. He raised his glass in a brief salute before disappearing back into the swirling crowd of nobles. Evelyn allowed a small, triumphant smirk to pull at the corner of her mouth. The lie was solid. It was impenetrable. They had completely rewritten history, wrapping themselves in a cloak of righteous victimization. There was no one left to challenge their narrative. The outcast was undoubtedly a frozen corpse buried deep beneath the spring thaw of the mountain pass, her bones scattered by scavengers. The matriarch adjusted the heavy sapphire necklace resting against her collarbone, a piece she had personally taken from her late husband's vault, and allowed herself to fully relax into the intoxicating atmosphere of the banquet. When the sovereign addresses the hall, Evelyn instructed, her voice low and demanding, "You will step forward immediately, Gideon. You will present the tithe and ask for the trade exemption before the southern lords have a chance to speak. We must establish our dominance early. Do not let his legendary temper intimidate you. He is a king, yes, but he relies on our grain to feed his armies. You are negotiating from a position of absolute strength." Gideon straightened his crimson coat, his confidence completely inflated by the poisonous flattery of his mother-in-law. "I know how to handle power, Evelyn. I will not falter." He had absolutely no concept of the tidal wave of destruction that was currently gathering just beyond the heavy oak doors of the vast chamber. Evelyn was oblivious that the king's personal guard had already seized her forged ledgers. She had no inkling the ancient magic in the capital had awakened, and she definitely remained blind to the fact that the girl she had cast out to die was currently wearing the colors of the royal house. All she knew was the intoxicating thrill of her own manufactured victory. Suddenly, the grand symphony of strings and drums abruptly ceased. The silence that fell over the massive space was instantaneous and absolute. It was not a gradual fading of conversation. It was a violent, collective holding of breath. The ambient chatter of hundreds of nobles was instantly snuffed out, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a heavy staff striking the obsidian floor at the far end of the room. Kalen Voss, the highly observant royal messenger and personal guard, stood upon the elevated landing, his face a mask of uncompromising, lethal duty. The sound echoed through the vaulted ceiling, commanding the absolute, undivided attention of every predator in the room. The air pressure in the vast hall dropped violently, a physical shift that made the hairs on the back of Gideon's neck stand on end. The heavy, intoxicating scent of the room was suddenly and completely eradicated. It was violently pushed out, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of crushed cedar, ancient ozone, and the feral burning scent of molten amber fire. The signature aura of the Alpha King. "The sovereign approaches," Kalen boomed, his voice amplified by ancient acoustics to reach every corner of the vast space. "Bow your heads and present your throats to Valerius Sterling, supreme monarch of the Lycan Empire, the unbroken shadow, the lord of the true bloodline." Every single person in the room, from the most powerful warlords to the wealthiest matriarchs, immediately dropped to one knee. The synchronized rustle of heavy silk, velvet, and military leather filled the silence as hundreds of bodies lowered themselves in absolute submission. Gideon's knees hit the hard stone floor with a sharp crack, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them flat on the ground. Beside him, Marilyn sank into a deep, graceful curtsy, keeping her head bowed, but peeking upward through her eyelashes, desperate to catch a glimpse of the legendary, terrifying ruler. Evelyn knelt with rigid, practiced precision, her heart hammering with the anticipation of the political victory she was about to claim. And the messenger continued, his voice rising in volume, echoing with a new, unprecedented weight that sent a ripple of absolute shock through the kneeling crowd. Present your absolute devotion to the true heart of the Empire, the light of the North, the sun-born sovereign, the true Luna. Gideon frowned, his brow furrowing as he stared at the floor. The title was completely unfamiliar. The king had never claimed a mate. The throne had been empty for 7 years, the ruler entirely consumed by military conquest and a legendary, terrifying temper. A new queen? The political implications raced through Gideon's mind, a sudden spike of anxiety mixing with his arrogant confidence. "Rise, and witness your Luna," the guard commanded. The heavy, intricately carved mahogany doors at the top of the grand marble staircase swung open with a massive, echoing groan. The crowd rose slowly, a collective, hesitant movement, as hundreds of eyes turned toward the elevated landing. When the royal couple stepped into the light of the floating embers, the silence in the room deepened into a state of absolute, stunning paralysis. The towering, lethal predator of the Empire stood at the top of the stairs, looking more dangerous and magnificent than any stories had ever described. Valerius Sterling wore a formal military uniform of midnight black, heavily accented with pure silver. He did not wear a crown because the sheer, crushing weight of his physical presence rendered any manufactured symbol of authority completely redundant. His tempest-grey eyes swept over the massive crowd with the cold, calculating detachment of a god surveying mortals. He was a force of nature, a monolith of ancient, unbroken magic, but it was not the terrifying ruler who stopped the breath in the lungs of every noble in the room. It was the woman standing beside him. She did not walk a step behind him in the manner of traditional pack wives. She stood perfectly parallel to the monarch, her small, delicate hand resting lightly upon the crook of his massive, leather-clad arm. Gideon Drake's crystal goblet slipped from his suddenly numb fingers. The expensive glassware hit the polished obsidian floor, shattering into 100 glittering pieces, the dark red wine splashing across the hem of his crimson coat like a fresh bloodstain. The sharp, violent sound of the breaking glass was the only noise in the entire hall, but Gideon could not hear it. The blood was roaring in his ears with the deafening force of a hurricane. His lungs completely forgot how to process oxygen. It was impossible. It was a hallucination brought on by the heavy ambient magic. It had to be. Standing at the apex of the royal staircase, radiating an aura of supreme, unshakable authority, was Seren Vantrell. The transformation was so profound, so absolutely staggering, that for a fraction of a second, Gideon genuinely believed his mind had snapped. The girl he had discarded at the altar in the Great Hall of Winterstone Keep. The quiet, mousy bookkeeper who had worn drab, heavy fabrics to hide her lack of a shifted wolf no longer existed. The woman standing before the Empire was a literal manifestation of divine right. Seren wore a gown crafted from what appeared to be liquid starlight. The pristine white silk draped over her curves with flawless elegance, completely devoid of the chaotic, desperate extravagance that Marilyn had draped herself in. The fabric shimmered with a subtle, internal light, shifting like moonlight on water with every breath she took. Her long, silver-white hair, which she had always kept tightly braided and hidden away at Winterstone, now cascaded in loose, unbound waves over her shoulders, glowing with a healthy, vibrant luster. Resting against her collarbone, impossible to ignore, was the ancient sun-born Pondon. It was no longer a dormant, hidden secret. The amulet blazed with a warm, steady, blindingly pure golden light that pushed back the shadows of the expansive room. Over the last 3 months, hidden away in the luxurious safety of the sanctuary chamber, a miracle had occurred. Seren had used the ancient, unbinding magic of her sunborn blood to completely cure Valerius of the silver poisoning curse. For 7 years, the dark, toxic curse inflicted by warlocks had been slowly freezing the monarch's blood, manifesting as pulsing black veins on his left forearm. The cold had been meant to kill him from the inside out. But in the quiet warmth of her embrace, the golden light of her pendant had drawn the poison from his veins, leaving behind only the thrumming, vibrant heat of their undeniable mate bond. And her position at the royal court was no longer merely bound by a mating mark. Just days prior, the royal physicians had bowed until their foreheads pressed into the stone floor, weeping as they confirmed the impossible truth. Seren was carrying his fated heir. A new heartbeat thrummed within her, a tiny glowing ember of pure Lycan strength and sunborn light. She was not just a mate, she was the mother of the Empire's future. She kept her head bowed slightly, maintaining that signature, unbroken dignity. But as she reached the edge of the staircase, she slowly lifted her chin, and her spine straightened into a posture forged from unyielding iron. She looked out over the sea of faces, her expression a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. Her eyes, once clouded with the exhaustion of survival, were now twin panes of brilliant, piercing frost. Evelyn Vantrell stopped breathing, the matriarch's heavily powdered face drained of all colour, turning a sickly, ashen grey. The cruel, calculating machine of her mind ground to a violent, catastrophic halt. Her knees literally buckled beneath the weight of the impossible reality, and she was forced to grab the edge of a nearby banquet table to prevent herself from collapsing into the dirt. The stepdaughter she had starved, mocked, and ultimately driven out to die in a sub-zero blizzard was not a frozen corpse. She was the most powerful female on the continent. Beside her, Marilyn let out a thin, reedy gasp that sounded like a dying animal. The usurper took a stumbling step backward, her extravagant silk gown suddenly feeling like a pathetic, heavy costume wrapped around a terrified child. The false glamour of her innocence was instantly burned away by the sheer, crushing reality of the true Luna's presence. Valerius felt the violent spike of terror radiating from the Winterstone delegation. A low, subsonic growl vibrated deep within the broad expanse of his chest, a sound so dark and feral it made the floating embers overhead flicker and dim. He shifted his stance slightly, his massive body angling to shield his pregnant mate, though she needed absolutely no physical protection from the insects cowering below. The glowing connection uniting them thrummed with a heavy, steady warmth, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the hammering of his heart and the tiny heartbeat of their unborn child. He reached over with his free hand, his long, scarred fingers gently wrapping over the top of Seren's small hand where it rested on his arm. It was a gesture of profound, public devotion. He did not pull her, he did not command her. He simply anchored her, grounding her in the physical reality of his absolute protection. The entire hall watched in stunned disbelief as the most ruthless killer in the history of the Northern Territories touched the silver-haired woman with the agonizing tenderness of a man handling a priceless, fragile relic. "We walk together," Valerius murmured, his deep, gravelly voice carrying only to her ears, laced with a heavy, solemn gravity. "They will see exactly what they threw away, and they will choke on the realization." Seren did not smile, she did not gloat, she did not display a single ounce of the hysterical vindication that Evelyn would have paraded if their positions were reversed. She simply began to descend the grand marble staircase, her steps perfectly synchronized with the heavy, measured boots of the monarch beside her. With every step they took, the crowd parted violently. The elite nobles of the realm scrambled backward, desperate to clear a path, terrified of accidentally brushing against the aura of the royal couple. The silence was so absolute that the soft rustle of her white silk gown sounded like the rushing of a mighty river. As they reached the floor of the expansive hall, Valerius did not guide them toward the high table. Instead, with a slow, deliberate calculation that practically radiated lethal intent, he steered their path directly toward the small cluster of provincial nobles from Winterstone Keep. Gideon Drake stood completely paralyzed. His mind was screaming at him to move, to bow, to run, but his muscles were locked in a state of primal, biological terror. The shattered remains of his wineglass lay at his feet, the red liquid soaking into his expensive boots. But he could not look away from the woman approaching him. This was the woman who had quietly managed his ledgers. The woman who had bound his wounds with smelling herbs when he was too proud to call a physician. The woman he had publicly humiliated and discarded for a prettier, louder, more manipulative replacement. When he had thrown the shattered ring of betrothal to the stone floor during the public rejection, she hadn't begged. Because begging wouldn't have changed the outcome of that night. She had simply walked away in absolute silence. And 15 minutes later, the imperial coach had arrived to rewrite the course of history. Now, she had returned, wrapped in the crushing power of the Empire's ultimate ruler, carrying royal blood. Valerius stopped precisely 3 paces away from Gideon. The king's towering frame loomed over the younger man like a dark mountain threatening an avalanche. The storm-glass grey of his eyes swirled with a violent, terrifying promise of pain. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his presence forced Gideon's weaker wolf to whimper internally, completely submitting to the apex predator. It was Seren who broke the silence. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell or hurl accusations. She innocently looked at the individual who ruptured his sacred vow to her. Her gaze swept over his wine-stained coat, over the terrified, trembling form of Marilyn clinging to his side, and finally, over the ashen, horrified face of her stepmother. Her eyes were completely devoid of anger. There was no hatred, no sorrow, no lingering pain. There was only the cold, detached observation of a sovereign looking at something entirely insignificant. "Gideon Drake," she spoke, her voice ringing out through the dead-silent room with the clear, unshakable tone of a ringing bell. "I see you have brought the tithe from Winterstone. I trust the journey through the mountain pass was not too treacherous for your delicate constitution." The words were perfectly polite, flawlessly diplomatic, and absolutely devastating. It was not a reprimand. It was a complete, total dismissal of his worth as a man and as a leader. She was addressing him not as a former lover, not as a betrayer, but as a minor, subservient vassal addressing his queen. Gideon's jaw opened and closed, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. A cold sweat broke out across his entire body. The devastating reality crashed down upon him with the weight of a falling anvil. He had not just made a personal mistake, he had committed political and social suicide. Marilyn let out a pathetic, stifled sob, her knees finally giving out as she collapsed to the floor in a heap of extravagant silk and ruined pride. She pressed her face into the cold stone, unable to withstand the blinding, golden light radiating from her stepsister's chest. The fake glamour of her innocence was completely shattered. Evelyn could not speak. The matriarch was trapped in a suffocating nightmare of her own creation. She watched the monarch's large, scarred hand gently squeeze her stepdaughter's fingers, a public, undeniable declaration that any strike against this woman would be met with the full apocalyptic wrath of the Empire. Not used, not owned, chosen. Valerius finally shifted his gaze from the trembling Gideon to the matriarch. The molten amber fire flared in his eyes, the feral beast completely unleashed just beneath his skin. "Winterstone," the king rasped, his voice vibrating with a lethal, dark fury that sent a violent shudder through every noble in the room. "Your tithe is an insult born of theft. Your presence is an infection." Valerius raised his hand. The sharp, physical gesture was immediate. From the shadows of the massive space, Kaelan stepped forward, accompanied by a dozen heavily armed royal guards carrying heavy cold iron chains. He did not hold a ceremonial staff this time. The guard held the actual, original financial ledgers of Winterstone Keep, the unedited books that proved exactly who had drained the estate's vaults. Gideon Drake, Evelyn Vantrell, Marilyn Vantrell. Valerius's voice thundered through the hall, a divine judgment crashing down upon them. You stand accused of historical tax fraud against the crown, the embezzlement of provincial resources, and high treason for attempting to assassinate the fated mate of your sovereign by exiling her into a deadly blizzard. No! Evelyn shrieked, her aristocratic mask completely disintegrating as two massive Lycan guards seized her arms. No, there is a mistake. She is a liar. She stole from us. Silence. The single word from Valerius hit the room like a physical blow. The ambient magic crushed down, forcing Evelyn's mouth shut so violently her teeth clicked together. Bind them, Valerius commanded smoothly, wrapping his arm securely around Seren's waist to protect the unborn life within her. Let them rot in the dungeons until the frost takes their miserable lives. Cold iron snapped, the sharp, brutal clatter of the metal, striking the polished obsidian floor echoed through the vast expanse of the grand hall, a definitive, percussive sound that severed the last remaining threads of the Winterstone delegation's arrogance. The heavy chains binding the traitors were not ceremonial. They were thick, unyielding restraints forged deep within the bowels of the royal dungeons, designed specifically to suppress Lycan's strength and drain ambient magic from anyone condemned to wear them. The beta heir fell to his knees in the dirt, weeping openly, the false medals on his chest clinking pathetically against the chains. Marilyn screamed hysterically as the cold iron shackles were forced onto her delicate, silk-covered wrists, her extravagant pearl gown tearing as she was dragged downward into the dust. Evelyn fought and clawed with wild, humiliating desperation, entirely stripped of her dignity, until the heavy chains forced her face down onto the polished obsidian floor. Valerius turned toward the massive crowd of terrified, silent nobles, keeping Seren firmly tucked against his side. The golden thread between them flared with brilliant, blinding light, matching the sunborn magic that pulsed from her chest and the fierce heartbeat of the royal heir she carried. "Bear witness to your sovereign," Valerius declared, his voice echoing with absolute finality over the weeping traitors chained at their feet. "Seren Vantrell is the true Luna of the Lycan Empire. Her word is my word. Her enemies are my enemies, and anyone who questions her place beside me will face the fire of my wrath." Gideon Drake, the individual who once stood upon a raised stone altar and proudly discarded his promised bride, was now a shattered, crawling shell of his former self. His knees scraped against the hard stone, dragging through the dark red puddle of the spilled elven wine and the jagged, glittering shards of his shattered crystal goblet. The expensive, deep crimson velvet of his military coat absorbed the liquid like a fresh, bleeding wound. He did not care about the ruined fabric. He did not care about the hundreds of elite nobles, pack alphas, and high-ranking dignitaries watching him with expressions of absolute, horrified disgust. His entire reality had violently collapsed, and his mind was scrambling, frantically searching for a way to rewind the clock. "Seren," the fallen heir rasped, his voice cracking into a high, reedy pitch that entirely lacked the artificial, booming confidence he had projected just moments ago. He dragged himself a few inches forward, the heavy chains rattling violently against the stone. His chest heaved with frantic, shallow breaths, pulling in air that felt too thin to sustain him. "Seren, please. You must understand. I was blind. I was manipulated by them. By her." He threw a desperate, wild glance backward, nodding frantically toward the matriarch, who was currently pinned to the floor by the royal guard. The betrayal among thieves was instantaneous. "Evelyn poisoned my mind," Gideon pleaded, his trembling hands reaching out toward the hem of her pristine white silk gown, though the guards ensured he was kept several paces away. "She told the elders you were a threat to the bloodline. She twisted my wolf against you. But I never wanted this, the bond we shared in our youth, the years you managed the estate, the times you healed me. That was real. You know it was real. You cannot let him execute me for a lie I was forced to believe." Standing at the apex of the royal dais, the silver-haired queen looked down at the pathetic, weeping creature dragging himself through the dirt. There was no triumphant smirk on her face. There was no hysterical vindication in her chest. The hollow ache that had once haunted her ribcage was entirely absent, but it had not been replaced by vengeance. It was simply a cold, sterile vacuum of absolute indifference. She looked at the beater who ruptured his sacred vow, the male who discarded her into a sub-zero blizzard to die, and realized with striking clarity that she felt absolutely nothing for him. He was not a monster to be feared. He was merely an insect that had lived its entire life, believing it was a wolf. Before Seren could open up her mouth to deliver a response, a sound tore through the heavy silence of the room. It was not a roar, nor a shout. It was a low, subsonic vibration that originated from the deepest, most feral depths of the ruler's chest. The air pressure in the colossal chamber dropped so violently that several of the lesser nobles in the crowd gasped, instinctively, clutching their chests as their eardrums popped. The thousands of enchanted floating embers illuminating the vaulted ceiling suddenly flickered and dimmed, completely overpowered by the sheer, crushing density of the Lycan ruler's aura. Valerius Sterling did not move quickly. He took a single, deliberate step forward, placing his massive, leather-clad frame entirely between his pregnant mate and the chained traitor on the floor. The temperature in the hall skyrocketed. The ambient scent of exotic spices and roasted meats was instantly incinerated, replaced by a suffocating, violent wave of crushed cedar, ancient ozone, and the scorching heat of molten amber fire. "You dare to speak her name," Valerius whispered. The quietness of the monarch's voice was infinitely more terrifying than any scream. It carried a lethal, inescapable gravity, echoing off the obsidian pillars like the tolling of a funeral bell. The icy silver of his eyes had completely vanished, swallowed whole by the feral, blazing gold of his inner beast. His terrifying aura exploded outward in a physical shockwave of pure dominance. It hit the crowd like a solid wall of iron. Every single dignitary, warlord, and courtier who had already been kneeling was forced flat against the stone floor, their bodies instinctively flattening themselves in a desperate display of absolute biological submission. It was not a choice. The apex predator of the Empire had unleashed his wrath, and the natural law of the Lycan world demanded that all lesser creatures bow or be crushed beneath the weight of his fury. Gideon hit the floor violently, his breath knocked completely out of his lungs as the invisible, suffocating pressure pinned him to the ground. He could not lift his head. He could barely expand his ribs to draw in a breath. "You dare to claim a bond with the sovereign of this empire," the towering ruler continued, his heavy boots closing the distance until he stood directly over the trembling beater. "You, who allowed a piece of cheap cold iron to define her worth. You, who stood before your pathetic pack and chose a manufactured illusion over the true light of the North. You threw a diamond into the snow because you were too weak to carry its weight. No." A shrill, hysterical shriek shattered the heavy, oppressive tension. Evelyn Van Trell thrashed wildly against the iron grip of the massive Lycan guards pinning her arms. The aristocratic mask she had so carefully maintained for decades had entirely disintegrated, leaving behind the crazed, spit-flecked visage of a cornered rat. Her heavily powdered face was smeared with dust from the floor, her intricate hairstyle ruined and tangled. "She is a fraud," the matriarch screamed, her voice tearing at her own throat in sheer, unadulterated denial. She refused to accept the reality unfolding before her eyes. To accept it meant accepting her own absolute destruction. She is a wolfless curse. The magic she carries is a disease. She has bewitched the throne. You are crowning a parasite who will drain the life from this kingdom, just as she drained the wealth from our vaults. She stole the unedited financial ledgers to frame us. She is. The heavy wooden staff of Kalen Voss struck the stone floor with a deafening crack. "Gag the traitor," the royal messenger commanded sharply, his face a mask of uncompromising military disgust. Before the guards could carry out the order, a small, Warm hand reached out and gently grasped the thick leather bracer on the Alpha King's forearm. The touch was featherlight, but its impact was earth-shattering. The violent, suffocating pressure of the monarch's aura ceased expanding instantly. The sacred tie bridging their spirits thrummed with a soothing, steady rhythm, pushing back against the feral rage threatening to consume his mind. Valerius paused, the muscles in his jaw ticking violently, his massive chest heaving as he turned his head to look at his mate. Seren stepped out from behind the physical shield of his broad shoulders. The ancient sunborn Pandon, resting against her collarbone, flared with a brilliant, blindingly pure light, illuminating the dark corners of the hall and cutting through the suffocating terror in the room. She did not look at the screaming stepmother with anger. She merely looked at her with the quiet, profound pity reserved for the truly damned. "Let her speak, Kaelin," the true Luna commanded gently, her voice carrying an innate soothing authority that required no shouting to be heard. She glided forward, the pristine white silk of her gown whispering against the obsidian floor, until she stood directly before the hysterical woman. "You spent my entire life trying to convince the world that silence was a symptom of weakness." The silver-haired queen spoke, her tone perfectly level, echoing with the unshakable certainty of her bloodline. "You taught your daughter to be loud, to be extravagant, to fill every room with noise, so that no one would notice the hollow emptiness inside her. You built an entire empire on lies, forged documents and stolen wealth. And yet, the moment the wind blew, your entire fortress crumbled into dust." Evelyn glared up at her, her chest heaving, the venom in her eyes burning with impotent, frantic hatred. "You think you have won because you seduced a monster?" The older woman hissed, spitting the words like poison darts. Seren did not flinch. She kept her spine perfectly straight, her chin parallel to the floor, embodying the exact same dignified posture she had held on the night she was cast out into the blizzard. But this time she was not walking away. Not used, not owned. "Chosen," Seren stated, the words resonating through the silent hall with the weight of ancient law. She reached down, her delicate fingers lightly touching the pulsing golden amulet at her throat. "I did not seduce the power of this empire, Evelyn. I healed it. While you were busy hoarding stolen coin and manufacturing false decrees, I was breaking a curse that your greatest warriors could not even comprehend. You threw me to the wolves, completely unaware that I was destined to command the entire pack." The absolute, terrifying truth of her words finally seemed to pierce through the thick armor of the matriarch's delusion. Evelyn's crazed eyes widened, the blood draining completely from her lips as the sheer, inescapable reality of her situation took hold. There was no political maneuver left. There was no lie clever enough to undo the magic radiating from the pregnant sovereign standing before her. Seren turned her gaze away from the broken woman, sweeping her frosted eyes over the trembling forms of Gideon and Marilyn, before finally looking out at the hundreds of nobles, still kneeling in silent awe. "By the divine right of the Lycan throne and the ancient blood of the sun-born lineage, I render my judgment," the queen declared, her voice carrying the absolute finality of a falling executioner's blade. "Gideon Drake, you are hereby stripped of your title, your rank, and your alpha lineage. You are no longer a son of the North. Evelyn and Marilyn Vantrell, your nobility is revoked. Your lands, your stolen wealth, and your estate are seized by the crown to repay the historical tax fraud committed against the provinces." She paused, allowing the crushing weight of the decree to settle over the weeping traitors. "You will not be granted the mercy of a swift execution," Seren continued, her voice dropping to a cold, detached whisper that chilled the blood of everyone listening. "You will be escorted to the deepest, lightless levels of the royal dungeons. You will live the rest of your natural lives in the absolute, freezing dark, surrounded only by the silence you so desperately tried to force upon me. You will be forgotten." "No, please, Seren, you cannot do this," Marilyn finally wailed, her voice tearing through her throat as she thrashed against her cold iron shackles, her extravagant pearl gown ripping at the seams. "We are sisters. We share blood. We share nothing, the Sovereign replied, turning her back on the pathetic display without a single ounce of hesitation. She walked smoothly back to the side of the towering monarch. Valerius watched her approach with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. The feral gold in his eyes had softened back into the stunning, swirling metallic hue, completely subdued by the flawless, merciless grace of his mate. He extended his heavy, leather-clad arm, and she placed her small hand upon his sleeve, securing her place at the pinnacle of the world. "Take them away," Valerius commanded, his voice dismissing the traitors as if they were nothing more than bothersome dust. "If they make another sound, cut out their tongues." The royal guards hauled the three screaming, sobbing prisoners to their feet, dragging them roughly backward out of the grand hall. The heavy oak doors slammed shut with a massive echoing boom, sealing the fate of Winterstone Keep and eradicating the last remnants of the Queen's painful past from the light of day. The silence that followed was not oppressive. It was the clean, breathable silence of a wound that had finally been completely purged of infection. The public unmasking was over. The justice was absolute. The transition from the magicked, dense, suffocatingly opulent atmosphere of the throne room to the crisp, freezing clarity of the high palace balcony was a physical shock that Seren welcomed with a deep, cleansing inhale. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them, muting the distant, frantic murmuring of the court as they were left to process the apocalyptic shift in power that had just occurred. Out here, suspended hundreds of feet above the sprawling imperial capital, the world felt infinitely larger and significantly more peaceful. The night sky was a canvas of deep, bruised indigo, scattered with thousands of brilliant, diamond-bright stars that seemed to reflect the golden lights burning in the city below. The wind at this altitude was vicious, carrying the sharp, biting chill of the high mountains, a sensory reminder of the harshness of the empire they ruled. But Seren did not feel the cold. Before the wind could even attempt to bite through the thin silk of her gown, a massive, heavy weight settled over her shoulders. The Alpha King stepped directly behind her, wrapping his enormous black wolf fur coat completely around her small frame, essentially swallowing her whole in a fortress of impenetrable heat. The intoxicating scent of cedar, ozone, and amber immediately engulfed her senses, triggering a deep, biological relaxation in her muscles. Valerius did not step back. He closed the remaining distance, pressing his broad, solid chest flush against her back, acting as a physical shield against the elements. His massive arms wrapped securely around her waist, his large hands resting gently, reverently over the slight curve of her stomach, where their fated heir rested safely. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The adrenaline of the confrontation was slowly bleeding away, leaving behind a profound, heavy intimacy. Their unbreakable metaphysical bond vibrated with a slow, contented rhythm, wrapping around them like a warm, protective cocoon. Seren leaned her head back, resting it against the hard, unyielding muscle of his shoulder. She looked down at the sprawling capital. It was a kingdom of warriors, of ancient magic and brutal history, and yet it was currently resting entirely in the palms of her hands. "Are you at peace, my Luna?" Valerius murmured, his deep, gravelly voice rumbling directly against her ear, sending a shiver of pure electricity down her spine. She turned the question over in her mind, analyzing the quiet stillness in her chest. She thought about the great hall of Winterstone. She thought about the shattered ring of Betrothal lying on the dirty flagstones. She thought about the agonizing, freezing pain of the blizzard and the absolute certainty she had felt that she was walking into oblivion. She had accepted her rejection in dignified silence, refusing to beg for a love that was fundamentally flawed. Because she had refused to compromise her worth for a coward, the universe had rewarded her with a god. "I am," she breathed, her hands coming up to rest over his thick wrists, anchoring his touch against her body. "I spent my entire life trying to make myself invisible, believing that if I took up too much space, they would destroy me. I thought the cold was my only sanctuary." Valerius tightened his grip slightly, his jaw clenching as a phantom spike of protective fury flared at the reminder of her past suffering. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet, delicate scent of chamomile and winterberries that belonged exclusively to her. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," the towering ruler rasped, his lips pressing a slow, lingering kiss against the sensitive skin beneath her ear. "You will never have to shrink yourself again. You will burn as brightly as the sun, and I will stand in your light until my dying breath." Seren turned in his arms, the heavy fur coat shifting around her as she looked up into the striking thunder-grey eyes of the most dangerous man in the world. He was looking down at her with an expression of such raw, desperate devotion that it made her heart ache with a completely different kind of intensity. He was simply a lone soul that had wandered in the dark for 7 years, desperately searching for the exact frequency of her soul. Some wounds could only be healed with love, and as he leaned down to capture her lips in a deep, possessing kiss, the final lingering shadows of her past were completely obliterated by his light. The Empire was secure. The curse was broken, and the silent, discarded underdog had risen to become the undisputed, absolute sovereign of the Lycan realm. "Thank you for walking through the dark with us and joining our sanctuary tonight." She stepped aside once, believing herself unworthy, but she will never step aside again. Let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? Did the King's retribution and devotion satisfy you? Subscribe to join our pack for more stories of quiet strength, epic redemption, and absolute devotion.